Okay, let's dive into this incredibly dense but honestly absolutely fascinating 1969 essay by Paul Goodman. We're going to unpack his powerful warning about the ethics of technology. Written in a time of immense social upheaval, Goodman asks a question that feels just as urgent today. Can technology actually be humane? In this explainer, we're going to walk through his critique of the scientific establishment and explore the profoundly different path he suggested we take.
To understand where Goodman is coming from, we really have to trace a massive historical escalation. Think about this. Back in 1940, the federal budget for research and development was less than $100 million. But then, the Manhattan Project and the horrors of Hiroshima fundamentally changed the landscape forever. Fast forward to 1967, and that R&D budget exploded to a staggering $17 billion. It was exactly this intense militarization and centralization of science that sparked the 1969 protests by dissenting professors at MIT, which is basically the jumping-off point for Goodman's whole essay.
So, to navigate his philosophical breakdown efficiently, we're going to follow a clear roadmap of his core arguments: the crisis of science, the call for prudence, the ecological approach, decentralizing innovation, and finally, what he calls a new reformation.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the crisis of science, from heroic age to mass faith.
As we just noted, by 1967, the federal R&D budget had skyrocketed to $17 billion. Now, to put that into perspective for us today, while $17 billion was completely shocking in 1967, today we see single tech companies spending more than double that on AI research alone. But Goodman points out that this money wasn't just neutrally distributed. At the time, nearly 200,000 American engineers and scientists were spending literally all their time making weapons. The funding predetermined the entire course of American science, heavily favoring hardware, logistics, and secrecy over, say, a wandering, open dialogue with the unknown.
He neutrally reports a stark contrast to highlight this moral disconnect. On one side, we have what he calls scandalous priorities fueled by this massive budget. Things like overkill weapons, supersonic planes, annual car model changes, color television, and identical brand name drugs. But then, on the other side, we have fundamentally neglected human needs: water, air, food, health, and foreign aid. He argues that this economic wastefulness focuses vast, incredible brain power on essentially petty problems or downright destructive aims.
Because of all this, Goodman argues that science basically ceased to be just a method of discovery. Instead, it triumphantly, yet dangerously, became the new dogmatic religion of modern society. He called it a corrupted mass faith. It became inextricably tied to state power and military funding. And the remote consequence of that? A deep, deep alienation of the youth. It's a feeling of tech pessimism that probably sounds very familiar to us today, as they began to view this highly funded, regimented version of science as essentially inhuman and anti-life.
Moving on to Section 2, the call for prudence, rethinking innovation.
There's a quote here that really anchors his entire thesis. Technology is a branch of moral philosophy, not of science. Goodman is flat out demanding that technologists stop viewing their work as morally neutral. Because technology aims at providing efficient means for societal goods, technologists absolutely must take ethical responsibility for the remote consequences of their creations. They actually need to be trained to criticize the programs they're given to implement, not just blindly build them.
Let's clearly define what he means by prudence in this context. He defines it as foresight, caution, and utility. It's the technological modesty to innovate sparingly. In highly advanced countries, he argues we should actually innovate to simplify our overly complex systems instead of swamping ourselves with these neat solutions that ultimately just lead to bumper-to-bumper traffic and rolling blackouts.
We can actually see this prudence in action when we compare oversold top-down technology with intermediate technology. Oversold tech gives us bulldozed freeways, disposable machines, and supersonic transports. But intermediate tech, that gives us localized brilliance. Take Botswana, for example, where overgrazed pastures were literally destroying the economy. Imported fencing was way too expensive. So the solution? Devising mud fences using native labor and teachable know-how. It's a simple, scientifically sound technology that respects the local culture and solves the immediate human problem without imposing expensive, complex dependencies. It's brilliant.
That brings us to Section 3, the ecological approach, cooperating with complexity.
Goodman perfectly captures his belief on this when he writes, "It is the ecological wisdom of cooperating with nature rather than trying to master her." He argues that we have to respect complex systems that have evolved over billion years.
When we forcefully bulldoze them with tightly interlocked instant interventions, we disrupt delicate balances and create some truly terrifying remote effects.
There's a really stark contrast here between big science and what he calls shoestring science. Big science often relies on rigid centralized control, which can lead to crashingly inept programs, mainly because you simply cannot manipulate or push around complex systems. Shoestring science, on the other hand, respects natural systems. He gives this lovely example of a Yucatan tribe that educates its children to identify and pull up all the weeds in their region. By doing this selective weeding, what remains is a garden of useful plants that have naturally chosen to be there and now thrive. It's a subtle, localized intervention instead of arrogant, centralized control.
Goodman proves this point further with a wonderfully bizarre psychology experiment by Ralph Hefferline about the wisdom of the body. Subjects were wired to suffer an annoying buzzing sound. Now, the buzz could be silenced if the subject made a highly specific, unlikely gesture, like twisting their ankle in a very certain way. The fascinating result? Subjects silenced the alarm much faster through weird unconscious ankle twitches than when they were consciously trying to figure it out. Systems simply adjust better decentrally, without heavy-handed conscious control.
This naturally leads us to Section 4, decentralizing innovation, power to the independents.
Jet engines, zero-graphy, automatic transmissions, antibiotics, air conditioning. It is pretty mind-blowing to realize that all of these game-changing advancements came from independent researchers, small partnerships, and tiny companies, not massive corporate R&D teams. Goodman uses a 1965 Senate subcommittee report to show that big technological teams suffer from poor communication, awkward scheduling, and a total lack of single-mindedness. In fact, forced central planning often completely strips the humanity out of work. Goodman highlights this failure by sharing a tragically beautiful story of alienated Ford assembly line workers. Because they had absolutely no say in the uses of their work and felt their occupation was essentially useless amidst this massive glut of cars, they would actively sabotage the vehicles. They'd leave nuts and bolts to rattle inside the car bodies out of sheer frustration. Decentralization, Goodman argues, engages more minds directly with the work, eliminating this kind of deep systemic alienation.
And finally, Section 5, a new reformation, the transformation of conscience.
He makes this super bold comparison, likening the bloated, military-funded scientific establishment of 1969 to the moral corruption Martin Luther witnessed in Rome back in 1510. Goodman suggests that modern science has become a deeply flawed institution, full of nauseating phoniness, triviality, and wastefulness. Just as the pre-Reformation Church required a profound change in moral allegiance, Goodman argues that modern technology requires a religious-level transformation of conscience to become prudent, ecological, and decentralized.
So this leaves us with a stark choice between two paths. On one hand, the corrupted mass faith is science dominated by money, state power, secrecy, and warfare. On the other, the pure faith, which is the high tradition of science that we desperately need to reclaim, is defined by dedicated researchers acting objectively, respectfully, completely free of taboo, and immune to irrational authority. It's a return to science as a wonderful adventure that liberates the human spirit rather than subjugating it.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. I want to leave you with this final, incredibly provocative thought from Goodman. By pointing out the fundamental dilemmas and the surge of grassroots, decentralized pushback against big science, he challenges us to ask, are we on the eve of a transformation of conscience? Are the failures of modern, centralized technology finally pushing us toward a moral revolution where technology serves humanity rather than the other way around? It's a question from 1969, but honestly, it feels entirely written for us today.